Now, at the end of the Civil War, there were, historians say, anywhere from 4 to 5 million slaves. Now, remember, I talked about how we needed a whole person politics. So when I say we need a whole person politics, I'm asking that you hear what I'm saying with the wholeness of yourself. Because politics is usually a conversation that is so disconnected from emotion, so disconnected from heart, so disconnected from our deeper human reality that given that, no wonder it became so easy for that political system to separate us from our wisdom, to separate us from our heart, to separate us in time from our common sense. And we must return to those deeper oceans, those deeper dimensions within ourselves if we are going to heal our country now. Slavery started in the United States in the 1600s. Theoretically, at the beginning, not just theoretically, historically, it is believed that about 400,000 were originally brought over from Africa. The slave trade began to really rev up in the early 1800s with the introduction of the cotton industry. And as I said, by the time the slaves were emancipated, anywhere from 4 to 5 million slaves existed on this planet. Now, as Martin Luther King would say years later, it's not just an issue of that they were freed. What were they freed to? The former slave population was promised by General Tecumseh Sherman, for every slave family of 4, they were to be given 40 acres and a mule. Now, 40 acres and a mule is almost like this saying, 40 acres and a mule. Think for a moment, please, what 40 acres and a mule would have meant. One thing about slaves, they certainly had a skill set, all of them, because they had been forced laborers. Now, you are freed, but you have to make a living. You have to be able to live. So think what that 40 acres and a mule would have meant. Now, this is where the undereducation of the average American begins. At the end of the Civil War in 1865, federal troops were stationed in the South to ensure that slavery would not be reinstituted as an institution. And they remained there until 1877. During that time, interesting, many blacks, former slaves included, were elected to roles in politics, both locally on a state level and federally. However, think now with psychological perspicacity. The South did not give up slavery because they became wise one day. They gave up slavery because they lost the war.
Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. This is Eugene Doc Stories and I hope that you're doing fine wherever you are today. So the main aim of American Civil War, which happened in 1861 to 1865, was to address the deeply divisive issues of slavery and states' rights. Now, for the Confederacy, which composed of the southern states that seceded from the Union, the primary goal was to preserve their way of life. The way of life was to keep Black Americans into slavery, or to keep African Americans into slavery, right? And to assert their right to secede from the Union and govern themselves. Now, for the Union, the war was initially about preserving the nation and preventing the secession of the southern states. However, the war progressed. The Union aimed to include the abolition of slavery, culminating in President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. Thus, the Civil War ultimately aimed to resolve whether the United States will remain a unified nation free from slavery. But with that, still, the people from the Southern United came up with Black Codes. Black Codes, these were, laws which were enacted in the Southern United States during the Reconstruction era, immediately following the Civil War. The primary goal was restricting freedoms of newly emancipated African Americans and maintain the social economic structure similar to slavery. These laws imposed had severe implication to Black people, as you know, these laws impose severe limitations on black people's rights, including the ability to work, to move freely, to own property, to participate in political life. The black codes included vagrancy laws, labor contracts, and restrictions on civil rights, all designed to enforce racial segregation and economic exploitation. Despite slavery being abolished through the slavery intervention, this shows you that after even the civil rights movements, the civil wars that black people tried to put into place, the systems or people from the Southern United or the Southern United at that time still perpetuated racism through the laws which they came up with, which were the Black Code. The Black Code, in as much as people were ending up with slavery, it was called the Reconstruction era. When people were doing away with slavery, still these people wanted to hold black people as slaves, to keep them laws that these laws were to, on their face, tell them that they are free, but again not free. So you realize that they just wanted to keep black people as always keep on working, revoke their rights to do some things. And so this leads us to our discussion today, and we are going to see this not African American professor, but this white professor who is called Marianne Williamson. She was presenting this information at Harvard Divinity School, and majorly it was talking about reparation for slavery and repentance in politics. Of course, a lot of things have happened to American black people or African Americans, if you can say. So this means that there is a lot that needs to be done, and the first step is one, repentance. Repentance starts with recognizing the problems that white people did to black people during those times, and also to look into the systemic issues which are still happening to black people until today, and the need or the reason as to why black people needs compensation in regards to slavery, in regards to what happened. So with me, I'm going to be presenting, apart from what this white professor she's going to say, and she's going to highlight some things which are really, really important that I want us to look into, that I want us to learn from, because trust me, when I say they are really, really important, they are important. So Marianne Williamson, she's going to address a number of things. And for I know she ever vied for presidency in the United States. And I don't know if she's still vying for that. But what I know is that her messages are really, really important. And we all need to be educated. We all need to learn. And along with that, I'll be giving you a presentation of how the black codes, worked and what really black code entailed. Join me today in today's presentation. This is your presenter, Eugene Doc Stories. And if you're watching this video for the first time, I'll ask you to subscribe to the channel, join the membership, and really get to see what we can offer you. Until then, let's dive right into the video.
I'd like to talk to you tonight about the role of repentance in national politics. Cassie was talking about getting sober. She was talking about the kinds of internal changes that are necessary in order to change our lives. And all that a nation is a group of individuals. So the same psychological and spiritual and emotional processes and dynamics that prevail within the journey of one individual prevail within the journey of a nation. And what we come to understand as individuals is that if you really want your life to change, you can't just tweak things on the outside. Now, when our country was founded, our founders thought of themselves, they wanted to be the Newtons of politics because they were products of the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was an important phase in world history. The Enlightenment, which overthrew the mystification of the early church and posited that we didn't need church dogma and doctrine to tell us what to do and who to be, but rather that we could be individuals with a capacity for reason. But what civilization, Western civilization, has gone through is what many people in our own spiritual lives go through. And that's when you throw out the religious dogma and the religious doctrine that you might have felt had simply imposed itself upon your thinking, but then later come to realize that you had thrown away the baby with the bathwater. And so what has happened in our civilization is that while it was certainly a step forward to throw off the shackles of an overly mystified religion, which those early religious forces were, what happened by the 20th century, of course, starting with the Industrial Revolution at the end of the 19th, was that we became so mesmerized by things of the outer world that our mesmerization with things of the external plane became another kind of shackle. And we had actually thrown off not just the over-mystification of religious dogma, but we had sacrificed a deeper connection with our own souls. Now, the science that became so popular during the 20th century aligned itself with this kind of mechanistic Newtonian science. But by the end of the 20th century, some new changes began to occur. And those new changes had to do, in large part, with quantum physics. It's interesting because Einstein said, the more I know about physics, the more I want to know about metaphysics. And as we enter the 21st century, we are entering a period of the new Enlightenment. And the new Enlightenment is one in which we realize that in the name of, in the words of a British physicist named James Jeans, it turns out that the world is not one big machine so much as it is one big thought. There was a Scottish painter named Edward Burne-Jones, who used to paint these huge angels. And I always loved these. When I was in college, I used to have posters of his angels on my wall. Years later, I was walking down the street in New York City, and I saw that at the Metropolitan Museum there was a whole exhibit of his angel paintings. And I was very excited, and I went in and I did that thing where you put on the headphones and you get to hear more than you would have known otherwise. And unbeknownst to me, he had painted these angels because he was part of the philosophical and artistic resistance, both in England and in the United States, against a resistance to what was happening with the industrialization of Western society, as they feared that industrialization would take us too far away from our spiritual lives. And he actually said, every time they build a machine, I will paint an angel. By the beginning of the 21st century, many of us have come to understand that something became deeply unbalanced in the 20th century. We became so mesmerized by the outer world that we became unbalanced and in too many ways lost contact with our souls. And we came to understand that, just as it says in the Course in Miracles, religion and psychotherapy are at their peak the same thing. Religious principle, in terms of universal spiritual themes, is not about doctrine, and it's not about dogma. It's about the things that Cassie was talking about. It's about the laws of consciousness. The real laws of consciousness aren't a matter of opinion. Books that really deal with deep spiritual truths aren't really trying to persuade anyone of anything. They're written more with a tone of just thought you might like to know. Because how consciousness operates is inalterable truth. There are inalterable rules of external phenomenon, and there are inalterable rules of internal phenomenon. If I drop this book, I know that it's going to fall on the table. You won't say about me, she's so faithful that she knew that. It's not that I'm faithful in the law of gravity. I just know that there is a law, and that if I drop the book, it will land on the table. Same with the laws of consciousness. And one of those laws is the law of cause and effect. It's simply an unalterable law. Now, one of the universal themes of the heart of all the great religious and spiritual teachings is some version of the idea that the universe is self-organizing and self-correcting. Now, you see this in the way the body operates. The cells know what to do. The cells follow a kind of natural intelligence by which they're assigned to work with other cells, to collaborate with other cells in order to serve the healthy functioning of the organ and the organism of which they're part. Every once in a while, as we know, a cell goes insane, and it disconnects from that natural intelligence, disconnects from its collaboration, from its collaborative function with other cells, and goes off to do its own thing. That is cancer. That is a malignancy in the body, and it is also a malignancy in consciousness. The human race has been infected by a malignant consciousness, which says it's all about me. I'm not here just to serve the healthy functioning of the pancreas. I'm not here to just serve the healthy functioning of the lungs. I'm not here to serve the healthy functioning of the whole. I'm here to do my own thing. That is a diseased thought. Separation from collaboration with the other is a diseased thought. But the body also has an immune system. So nature does know how to organize itself, but it also knows how to repair itself. And the repair work of the body is mirrored in the repair work of consciousness. And the repair work of consciousness is where, when we recognize that our thoughts have been mistaken, we have the capacity to rethink. Repenser, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. In all great religious systems, there is a version of the atonement. In Catholicism, when Catholics go to confession. In Judaism, the holiest day of the year is the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur. Cassie was talking about sobriety. In recovery, in the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, it is a very central part of recovery. The notion that we must take a serious moral inventory. We must be brutally honest with ourselves. We must atone for our mistakes, and we must make amends. Now, when we do that, it's kind of like a cosmic reset button. The idea is that at heart, we are all perfect creations of God, but living on this planet, we get confused. Living on this planet, we are lured into a thought system, as Cassie was saying, based more on fear than on love. It is the status quo of this planet. And that's why a spiritual journey, the journey of enlightenment, is the unlearning of the thinking of fear and the acceptance instead of love into your heart. However, the law of cause and effect is such, karma, it's called in the East, that whatever you think is going to take form on some level. Whatever you think will take form, and whatever you think and do will have a consequence. So the way to affect the consequences is to rethink the thought that produced that consequence. If you only try to change things on the level of effect, it's like going up to a screen at a movie saying, I don't like the plot, so if I change something, manipulate the screen somehow, it will be different. The atonement takes more than just manipulating the level of effect, because all effects will...
Hello, welcome back. Now, a little bit interruption from the sister, but I'm just going to be backing up whatever she's saying by trying to highlight first the origin and the context of the Black Code, because I believe we need to look at where these really came from. And you understand that the southern states really made it hard for Black people, while the Union victory tried so much to abolish, slavery, but the southern state still wanted, because they enjoyed Black people economically. So we're going to be looking at the origin and the context of the Black Code, that is during the post-civil wars in America. Now, you need to realize that the end of civil wars in 1865 marked really important moment in the U.S. history. And I'm not going to lie to that, because the Union led to the abolition of slavery. That is through the 13th Amendment. That is through the 13th Amendment, which legally freed almost 400 million African American as freed slaves. You know what I'm saying? So, but with all that, still, the southern states said, no, we want these Black people. We want their labor. We want them to still continue building the United States. And I know they were devastated by now these changes that the Union victory were coming, to abolish, slave trade. So this happened in 1865, right? So the southern states, economically and socially devastated by the U.S. war, they were determined to retain control over their former slaves. Now, the immediate post-war period, which is known as the Reconstruction, that is 1865 to 1877, was supposed to be a time for rebuilding the South and integrating freed African Americans into the society as full citizens. But you know what? Instead, many southern states passed laws known as the Black Codes, which sought to suppress the newly freed black population and maintain the racial hierarchy that had existed during slavery. Now, you understand, as people came out and saw to it that, slavery is not a good thing and we need to just get out of it. We don't need to still practice slavery. But with that being said, we still have people that saw to it, we need to still practice this. We need to still put this into practice. Because if we don't put this into practice, this means that we're going to be losing a lot of things. They're going to be losing their resources. They're going to be losing their powers and the social status or the social status that they were already having. So people from the southern states really made it so hard for black people. While other groups like the Unified Victory, which fought and led for abolition of slave trade, at least they tried. They saw to it, no, we've made a lot, and now it is time to integrate black people, African Americans or black Americans, into the society as full citizens. But now this was totally different. Now the greed of these people still made them to want to continue to enslave black people, to still continue to rip off the sweat, the blood, the pain of black people. Now they passed these Black Code laws. The Black Code laws favored them. And to a black person's face, you are free, but at the same time you're not free. Because still, they hindered black people from voting. They hindered them from their civic rights, you understand? So those are, one of the things which happened. And I'm going to be talking about the antebellum precedents. The antebellum precedents, you need to know one thing. The Black Codes didn't not emerge in a vacuum. They were rooted in earlier legal traditions and practices, such as the slave codes, which regulated the behavior of enslaved people before the Civil War. Because the Civil War was between, the Unified Victory versus the Southern states. The Southern states wanted to practice their traditional ways of still keeping black people as their slaves, while the Union Victory, they were so radical and they saw to it, we have made a lot of things out of black people. We have done a lot of things out of black people. Now let them put them as slaves. But now they didn't want that. Being the Southern states, being the traditionalists, still perpetuating what they called as the slave codes, we can term it as black codes. They continue practicing these laws which restricted the rights of enslaved African Americans, defining them as property rather than people and dictating every aspect of their life. You can realize how dehumaning that was, So after the emancipation, the southern states adopted these laws to apply to freed men, aiming to circumvent the new legal status of African Americans and keep them economically dependent and socially inferior. You realize it's a matter of giving and taking. I give you this and I take this. You're not going to have everything. So let's continue watching the video as we continue learning. I'll be back at the sidelines with my commentary. Until then, let's continue watching the video.
Ultimately result from the thoughts that produce them. Atonement is much deeper than that. Atonement is where we must come to understand, to recognize, and acknowledge the error. it is where we must, as they say in recovery, not only atone, but make amends where possible and appropriate. I'd like to read to you from a National Day of Fasting and Prayer proclamation written by Abraham Lincoln on March 30th, 1863. He said, "We have been preserved these many years in peace and prosperity. We have grown in numbers, wealth, and power as no other nation has ever grown. But we have forgotten God. We have forgotten the gracious hand which preserved us in peace and multiplied and enriched and strengthened us. And we have vainly imagined in the deceitfulness of our hearts that all of these blessings were produced by some superior wisdom of our own. Intoxicated with unbroken success, we have become too self-sufficient to feel the necessity of redeeming and preserving grace, too proud to pray to the God that made us." And then he went on. "It behooves us then to humble ourselves before the offended power, to confess our national sins, and to pray for clemency and forgiveness. It is the duty of nations as well as of men to confess their sins and transgressions in humble sorrow, yet with assured hope that genuine repentance will lead to mercy and pardon." There was no doubt much was written by Lincoln and done by Lincoln to make it very clear that he recognized the Civil War as a great shedding of blood that was a consequence of a great American sin. But when Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, and as well as the 13th Amendment, these were, while extremely significant, they were external remedies. And the stroke of a presidential signature and the passage of a constitutional amendment could abolish a particular institutional evil. But of course, those external remedies could not abolish racism. And racism, in many ways, burrowed even more deeply, if one can even imagine, even more deeply into the consciousness of many Southerners after the Civil War. Now, I don't believe that the average American is racist. That's not my sense or my experience. But it is my sense and experience that the average American is deeply undereducated and not so much misinformed, underinformed about the history of race in the United States, particularly since the Civil War. This is not to minimize the progress that has been made, the sacrifices that have been made, the struggles, or even the successes of any of our ancestors, black or white. But it is to say that healing is a journey. It is a process, and sometimes we might think more has been achieved than on certain levels has yet been achieved. At the end of the Civil War, I think we would all agree that if you have kicked someone to the ground, you have a moral responsibility to do more than to just stop kicking. You have a moral responsibility to also say, "Here, let me help you get back up." Now, I feel strongly that in order for us to transform and heal our country, we need an integrative politics, just like there was a transformation in our thoughts about medicine and physical healing when we opened up to an integrative paradigm, realizing that there's more to healing than just external allopathic measures. There are also psychological and emotional and spiritual dimensions of healing the body. There are also emotional and psychological and spiritual dimensions to healing the body politic. We are all immune cells, and so many things that have happened that are challenging, to say the least, in our country over the last few years can be likened to opportunistic infections that could not have taken hold of us or certainly not as easily as they appear to have taken hold of us, had we not become weakened immune cells. In order for us to become the immune cells that we need to be so that our body politic can repair the way the body repairs when the immune system is healthy, we must be activated on spiritual and psychological and emotional levels before the kind of activism that is necessary will have the kind of fundamental effect in changing and altering the status quo. Now, at the end of the Civil War, there were, historians say, anywhere from 4 to 5 million slaves. Now, remember, I talked about how we needed a whole person politics. So when I say we need a whole person politics, I'm asking that you hear what I'm saying with the wholeness of yourself. Because politics is usually a conversation that is so disconnected from emotion, so disconnected from heart, so disconnected from our deeper human reality that given that, no wonder it became so easy for that political system to separate us from our wisdom, to separate us from our heart, to separate us in time from our common sense. And we must return to those deeper oceans, those deeper dimensions within ourselves if we are going to heal our country now. Slavery started in the United States in the 1600s. Theoretically, at the beginning, not just theoretically, historically, it is believed that about 400,000 were originally brought over from Africa. The slave trade began to really rev up in the early 1800s with the introduction of the cotton industry. And as I said, by the time the slaves were emancipated, anywhere from 4 to 5 million slaves existed on this planet. Now, as Martin Luther King would say years later, it's not just an issue of that they were freed. What were they freed to? The former slave population was promised by General Tecumseh Sherman, for every slave family of 4, they were to be given 40 acres and a mule. Now, 40 acres and a mule is almost like this saying, 40 acres and a mule. Think for a moment, please, what 40 acres and a mule would have meant. One thing about slaves, they certainly had a skill set, all of them, because they had been forced laborers. Now, you are freed, but you have to make a living. You have to be able to live. So think what that 40 acres and a mule would have meant. Now, this is where the undereducation of the average American begins. At the end of the Civil War in 1865, federal troops were stationed in the South to ensure that slavery would not be reinstituted as an institution. And they remained there until 1877. During that time, interesting, many blacks, former slaves included, were elected to roles in politics, both locally on a state level and federally. However, think now with psychological perspicacity. The South did not give up slavery because they became wise one day. They gave up slavery because they lost the war. So think about the cold dehumanization that must exist inside your heart to even own a slave. Now add to that layers of revenge and hatred even beyond anything you had known before. So the main emotional tone after the Civil War was a lot of resentment on the part of Northerners for what they had had to sacrifice to fight the war, and resentment on the part of Southerners that they had lost it. So in many ways, the South just held its breath until the federal troops left. And at that point, the revenge and the hatred became enacted in full force. The Southern legislatures passed what were called Black Code laws. And the Black Code laws were to ensure subpar economic and social and political opportunities for the former slave population and their descendants. Ku Klux Klan, John Birch Society, spate of lynchings where any black would be hanged whites who supported them hanged. Now follow this timeline. The war is over in 1865. The federal troops left in 1877. Then everything I just mentioned comes to full force and fruition by 1900. So that...
Okay, welcome back again. Now, from where we're talking about the sighting of what she's also addressing. Now, look, the unified states, they tried so much to still keep these laws. But there's one thing that I want to say. You know, the black codes really varied from one state to another. They were never same, right? But there were those features which were similar to all of, you know, these states. Now, these states, these laws generally, as I said, they were designed to control the labor and behavior of African Americans. And here with me, I have some key characteristics of, you know, how they implemented the black codes, you know, how the southern states implemented the black codes. Now, I'm going to be talking about labor contracts. Now, listen. Many black codes required African Americans to sign a yearly labor contract with white landowners. Those who refused could be arrested for vagrancy and forced into unpaid labor. Required all, for example, the Mississippi Black Code required all African men to provide written evidence of employment even for every January. If they left their job before the end of the contract, they would forfeit their wage and could be arrested. Those are amongst one of the things that these people tried to do. That if you didn't sign a contract that you had to sign, if you didn't sign a contract, you were punished. And the type of punishment is one, you could work for free, you know. You could work for free, and working for free, that means it's unpaid labor, and unpaid labor, it is just slavery, because at the same time you're being forced to sign these labor contracts, and these were done by white landowners to black people. So you realize how they did this, and if you failed to do that, you could be arrested for vagrancy. And now, which leads me to my second law, which also they try to put, that is the vagrancy laws. You know, vagrancy laws were the central features of the black codes. These laws made it illegal for African Americans to be unemployed, homeless, or loitering. If found guilty, they could be fined or subjected to forced labor. In South Carolina, just for instance, any freedman found without lawful employment or business could be fined and imprisoned. Upon failure to pay the fine, they would be hired out to white employers to work off the debt. That was crazy. That was really crazy. That any man, any black person who was found working freely without not signing any contract with a person or is not working in any firm would be imprisoned and fined. And after being fined, they would work to pay off the fine. That was really crazy. That was really, really crazy. And that's why the ladies explain that black people really needs reparations and the repentance of people from the southern, especially in places like Southern Carolina. Those places were really, really crazy for black people. I'm also going to be talking about apprenticeship laws as one of the third laws that the black codes usually used during those time. Now, southern states also enacted apprenticeship laws, which allowed courts to bind African American children, particularly orphans, to white employers as apprentices. Often without the consent of their parents or guardians, these children were frequently subjected to harsh labor conditions, reminiscent of slavery under the guise of training of trade. That was really crazy. But any African American child, any household with a child, the child could have been taken forcefully worked in severe conditions, harsh labor conditions that they worked in these places, even without the consent of the parents. And just to be realistic, where could the children get the concept if the parents themselves were still being enslaved in the name of Black Code? You are free, but at the same time not free. Let's continue watching the video.
By the beginning of the 20th century, full-on institutionalized white supremacy and segregation now existed firmly in the American South. None of this was fundamentally challenged or altered until Martin Luther King in the 1960s. So you have 2.5 centuries of the violence of slavery, followed by another 100 years of violence perpetrated against blacks. It was not the violence of slavery, but it's certainly social violence and economic violence and political violence. With the passage of the civil rights legislation, you have 2 major pieces of civil rights legislation in the middle of the 1960s. First, the Civil Rights Act, and the next year in 1965, the Voting Rights Act. So in 1965, the Civil Rights Act dismantled the external forms of segregation that existed in the South and elsewhere in the country until that time. And then the next year, the voting rights to ensure that blacks could have full participation legally and freely in voting in the United States. After that, there was a period when Richard Nixon was elected president in 1968. He had a domestic advisor who later became a senator in New York named Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And Daniel Patrick Moynihan said to Nixon, "Enough with the tumult of the 60s, the country needs to calm down." And he told Nixon that that should be, in terms of race relations in the United States, after the turbulence of the civil rights movement and so forth, that should be followed by a period of what he termed benign neglect. So that meant we're not going to actively try to hurt you, that's kind of not legal anymore, but we're not going to try to help you either. And so, just as Martin Luther King would point out so eloquently and in so many ways, although the freedom to blacks and to former slave population and their descendants was in many ways achieved. And as I said, this is not to minimize the extraordinary progress that was achieved in many of the ways that I've just mentioned. Number one, that doesn't mean the whole job was completed, and it is the job of our generation to recognize all the ways we're sliding backwards. In 2013, the John Roberts-led, obviously corporatist Supreme Court began chipping away at the Voting Rights Act. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg, in her dissent, said she likened it to being in a rainstorm. But you're not getting wet because the umbrella's working. So she said, so now we're going to take down the umbrella because we're not getting wet. And she said, we will certainly get wet again once you take down the umbrella. And that's exactly what happened. Because as soon as they began chipping away at the Voting Rights Act, behold, all these voter suppression efforts that are active throughout the country, obviously aimed at people of color and disenfranchised communities. That means we're sliding backwards. Mass incarceration means we're sliding backwards. Obvious racial disparity in our criminal sentencing and our criminal justice system obviously means we're sliding backwards. Now, as Abraham Lincoln said, we need to confess our national sins. We need to look at what in recovery is called our character defects. America has 2 main character defects. One has been with us from the beginning. One actually is relatively new. It's really only become this festering wound since the end of World War II. One is racism, and one is militarism. Now, with racism is inherent in this profoundly tragic dichotomy, this ironic dichotomy, which is in our cultural DNA. On one hand, in 1776, the most extraordinary principles were infused into the founding documents of our country, the Declaration of Independence, repudiating, overthrowing the status quo of aristocracy at that time, saying that this country would not belong to just a few people who were entitled, to land, to education, to wealth, and so forth, but rather that in this country, all men would be seen as created equal, that all men would be seen to have been given by God inalienable rights of life and of liberty and the pursuit of happiness. 41 of the men who signed that document were themselves slave owners. This is baked into the cake. This is the national tension that has been with us from the beginning, as generation after generation has been filled, both by those whose hearts are ablaze with the possibilities inherent in a society dedicated to the equality of opportunity, and also those whose basic attitude has been, no, we will not be doing that. But the historical narrative of America is that we tend to get it right ultimately. That is why slavery was followed by abolition. And even the genocide and cultural annihilation of Native Americans has been followed even now by a rising tide of consciousness, by people standing at Standing Rock, by a conversation about giving back the Black Hills of South Dakota to the Sioux, as they were promised in 1863, in a spate of lawsuits by which treaties that were usually not even negotiated fairly to begin with were then broken by the United States government. And there are more and more people, during the Obama administration, a suit that was settled for $83 million and so forth. The oppression of women was ultimately followed by two major waves of feminism and the suffragette movement. And of course, as we've already discussed, institutionalized white supremacy and segregation in the American South was followed by the civil rights movement. It was one generation's job to abolish slavery. It is our generation's job to abolish racism. It is our time in our society, not just on the issue of race, but on the issue of so many things, to look at our deep character defects, to look at the places where we need to atone. In my candidacy, I talk about the fact that millions of American children live in chronic trauma. I talk about the fact that we spend so many more of our resources preparing for war than we do actively waging peace, both domestically and internationally. But the issue of race continues to be this festering sore, and will be, until we address more than the external symptoms of this character defect, but also address the deeper areas of moral and spiritual dysfunction. Now, as I said before, if you have kicked someone to the ground, you owe it to them to do more than just stop kicking. You owe it to them to help them get back up. If you have taken $1,000 from me and you apologize to me, I'll say, great, thank you. I'd also like my money back. No one would say that if you took $1,000 from me, an apology would be enough. By the 20th century, first of all, it's to be noted, as I said, the former slave population was promised at the end of the Civil War reparations in the form of 40 acres and a mule. So even at that time, there was a realization for the need of economic restitution and economic reintegration or integration into free society in a way that otherwise would not be possible. And I think that if Abraham Lincoln had lived, things might have been different. But he died shortly after the end of the war. So now we are left with a situation where it has continued to be true ever since the end of the Civil War that the former slave population and their descendants have never statistically been able to keep up, to become equal, and to keep up with white society because of so many of the systemic legacies of slavery which have held them back. Now, I know a lot of people point out that we've had a black president and point out Tyler Perry and point out Oprah Winfrey and point out Magic Johnson, et cetera. The fact that that we have achieved a state in our country where geniuses, no matter who they are, can rise, while much to be celebrated, is not of itself social justice. Because in America, you shouldn't have to be a genius to make it. You should be a citizen of the United States who is entitled to the same opportunities as everyone else. That is the American dream. And so now we are living in a situation where our generation is called to continue the process and the journey of reconciliation. Since World War II, Germany has paid $89 billion in reparations to Jewish organizations. Now, the $89 billion that Germany has paid in reparations to Jewish organizations obviously cannot make the Holocaust not have happened. But it has had tremendous significance, not only economically, but psychologically.
I'm going to be talking about social and political control. The Black Codes also sought to limit the social and political rights of African Americans, and this is true. Despite being free citizens, just like I said, black people were largely barred from voting. They tried to interfere with their civic rights, holding public office or serving Jews. These measures were designed to prevent African Americans from getting or from gaining any political power or challenging white supremacy. The codes also mandated segregation in public spaces, laying, the groundwork for the later Jim Crow laws that all formalized racial segregation across the South. That black people, you could not participate in anything political, because that could be a moment for you to start fighting for your rights, to start standing against any injustices which were done against black people. They were not allowed because they were afraid if a black person gains a political power, they could challenge the white supremacy, just like what the Unified Victory tried to do. And still people from the Southern, they still perpetuated this. And how crazy, how really, really crazy it was, in that line, I'm going to be talking about what about the federal response. Why now did we start seeing, why did it had to end? Why did the Black Code had to end? What was the response of the federal government? What was their response in regards to this? Now, the Black Code continued for a number of time, but now they sparked an outrage among Northern politicians, particularly the radical Republicans, who believed in full civic rights of black people. Many African Americans and their allies resisted these laws through protests, legal challenges, and appeals to the federal government. The Northern press also widely condemned the Black Codes, viewing them as a betrayal of the Union's victory and the promises of the emancipation. Now, the end of the Black Code started like this. Now, we get to seeing the Northern politicians. Remember, these things happened in the South. Now, the Northern politicians, particularly the radical Republicans, started standing with black people. And now we could also see now the Northern press also joining. We have two powers, Northern politicians and the press. And those are two important factors that sparked the end of the Black Codes, because people were outraged. People were really sad about what was happening, and now they saw to it that, we just need to end this thing. And now, the Northern press widely condemned the Black Codes, viewing them as a betrayal of the Union's victory and the promises of emancipation, amongst other things, which also made the end of the Black Codes. I'm also going to be talking about congressional action. In response to the Black Codes, the U.S. Congress took several steps to protect the rights of freedmen. In 1886, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, which declared all persons born in the United States to be citizens, regardless of race, and granted them equal protection under the law. This was followed by the 14th Amendment. Remember, we had the 13th Amendment. Now we are seeing the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment which was ratified in 1868, which further solidifies citizenship rights and guaranteed equal protection for all citizens in the United States, regardless of the race. Now, the 15th Amendment now, which was now later on ratified in 1870, sought to protect African Americans' men right to vote by prohibiting racial discrimination in voting. Now we are starting to see some improvement, And now later on, we started seeing the Freedmen's Bureau. Remember, the 15th Amendment allowed African American men to vote. Now from there, we now started seeing the Freedmen's Bureau. Now the Freedmen's Bureau is another significant federal response, which was established of a freedman's Bureau. This is a government agency created to assist former slaves in the transition to freedom. Sometimes adapting to freedom, which was taken away from you. It's it's a little bit difficult. Now, the Bureau provided food, housing, education, and legal assistance. And it played a critical role in mediating labor contracts and protecting African Americans from exploitation from the black codes. Now they started negotiating contracts. Black people never engaged in the contracts themselves because they could have been still used by people from the southern. Now you see where the northern people tried so much in helping this. Now let's continue watching the video. Now before that, I'd like to say one thing. Just before continue watching the video, we have the military reconstruction, which is also an important part in making this shift or change to happen. Now, when the southern states continue to resist, the new federal laws Congress passed and the Reconstruction Act of the 1867, which divided Southern into military districts governed by the Union generals. These military governments, had the authority to oversee the enforcement of the civil rights, dismantle the black codes, and ensure that the Southern states drafted new constitution in the recognized rights of the African Americans. Now we're starting to see a wave of change because even seeing the military reconstruction, the military also standing for the human rights, and now that's when we're starting seeing change. Let's continue watching the video.
In terms of the German reconciliation with the Jews of both Germany and the rest of Europe. And many Americans don't realize that in 1988, Ronald Reagan signed the American Civil Liberties Act of 1988, through which all surviving prisoners, people who had been imprisoned in the Japanese internment camps during World War II, were given between $20,000 and $22,000. And I say that to point out that the idea of reparations by the middle of the 20th century is simply what civilized peoples do. It should not be considered some fringe idea. And that is why I believe it's so important to bring the discussion to the fore. Very, very smart people. From Ta-Nehisi Coates to Sandy Darity and others, have done a lot of work on this. I think anything less than $100 billion would be insulting. Some people think it's insulting to even mention that small an amount. I think this is a big topic, how much money we would be talking about. Obviously, you can't put a financial number on the level of evil that you're talking about when you're discussing something like slavery. But there is a full-on mea culpa that the Germans have made that I think has had a tremendous impact. I don't, with my own interest in metaphysics and understanding of how things work, I don't believe the German nation would be as up and successful and abundant as it is today had a couple of generations after the war not done the work that needed to be done, both in terms of reparations, in terms of full-on mea culpa, and also in terms of ensuring to Jews that every generation born in Germany would be given full-on Holocaust education. Because it's when you know the history that you see things completely differently. 2 or 3 popes ago, John Paul, before he died, did a lot of apologizing for the Catholic Church. And a phrase he used I found very compelling. He talked about the quote-unquote purification of memory. And he said that if you do not apologize, and I remember being particularly, you were talking about the witches, one of his apologies that meant a lot to me, Cassie, was the apologizing for the Inquisition. And I thought it should get much more news than it got. And he talked about the purification of memory being so important, saying that if you haven't apologized, you will remain unconscious of the ways and the times in which you repeat the sin. And that is what has happened so much with race in America. And that's why so often black people will see something to a completely different filter than white people, where a white person will say, oh, it's terrible that that happened. Whereas a black person is saying, no, it's not just it happened again. That's a completely different framework. It's one person sees an incident, another person sees a trend that's been going on for a long time, and that if unaddressed gets worse. Inertia means the tendency of the object to move in whatever direction it's been moving until there is a pattern interruption, the disruption of the status quo. At this point, so much of the status quo in America in terms of legacies of slavery and deep systemic racism is so baked into the cake that too often we do not even see that the behavior or that the pattern represented legacies of slavery. Paying reparations for slavery will not fix everything. The issue of race and racial reconciliation in the United States is obviously a multidimensional issue. And there is much repair work to be done, both internal and external. Cassie was talking before about white privilege and so many of the ways that the mechanisms of white supremacy are internalized. And just like after the Civil War, many of the external symptoms became internal symptoms that in a way were just as bad. I don't think we have to minimize, as I said before, the successes and the struggles and the deep sacrifices of our ancestors, either black or white, to simply acknowledge that it's time in our generation to take the next step in this journey. When you're talking about people who were enslaved for 2.5 centuries, and then you're talking about the fact that there was another 100 years of institutionalized violence perpetrated against them, it shouldn't be considered so outrageous that it's taken us another 100 years and then 40 years, well, not 40 years, 60 years, almost 60 years, 55 years since the Civil Rights Movement for us to get to the next point where we are ready to to further the task. And once you really understand and recognize that a nation is a group of people, that the same psychological and emotional and spiritual dynamics that prevail within the journey of an individual prevail within the journey of a nation. And when you read words of no less than Abraham Lincoln talking about how a nation must confess its sins, and particularly when you realize this is the 21st century now, our politics needs to keep up with the 21st century. What has happened in terms of paradigm change in medicine needs to happen now in terms of paradigm change with politics. We are treating politics today the way we used to treat medicine, strictly allopathically. You don't take care of any of the psychological, spiritual, or emotional, or even nutritional issues involved in keeping your body healthy, and then you just get sick and hope that you can apply some external remedy to making it well. We know better than that. And so now we need a whole person, integrative, holistic politics. It is not enough when a country has a stage 4 cancer in so many ways like ours does to just continue to talk about which topical ointment might make us well. We need to do some deep work in this generation. We must have a politics that is in keeping with 21st century thinking. And 21st century thinking reclaims some of the ancient truths of the great religious and spiritual traditions. You know, if this were the Middle Ages, spirituality was reflected in the architecture of a medieval town, where the church was in the center and all of the streets went off from there and radiated like the spokes on a wheel. Today, we treat spirituality and religion like it's just one other category. It's just another category. It's over here, and then there's health over here, and then there's relationships over there, and then there's business and money over there. We are reclaiming the realization that spirituality and deep religion, and I'm not talking here about dogma and doctrine, but deep religious principle are the laws of consciousness. And they are unalterable, and they are set. And when we have deviated from love, we have deviated from righteousness or right-useness, then atonement and amends are the way that we cosmically reset the trajectory of our future. And so for the United States, there are many ways in which we need to own some deep, deep errors. William Faulkner said the past isn't over. In fact, it's not even past. If you look at Germany today, and you look at generations of young Germans, you can feel, it's energetic, it's in the ethers, you can feel what a gift they were given by the generations that did the deeper work and paid the reparations. You don't feel them carrying around the karmic guilt like even you felt 20 and 25 years ago. And that is because that work was done. And yet we, with a civil war that ended in 1865, are still seeing generation after generation after generation burdened by this awful karmic toxicity. Some people, we say that we should just make incremental efforts at making this thing right. Isn't it funny? Whenever they want to do something really wicked in politics, they never talk about incremental efforts. Whenever they want to have huge multi-trillion-dollar tax cuts to the very richest among us, they don't talk about doing it incrementally, do they? When they want to talk about invading countries that did nothing to us and that turn out to be invasions that were the worst mistakes in American history, they don't, foreign policy history, they don't talk about doing these things incrementally. We need more than small, random acts of kindness now. We need huge, strategized acts of doing the right thing. Now, I'm running for the Democratic nomination for president, as you know, and the states that decide really what the political conversation will be that dominates our politics for the next 2 years or more are Iowa, South Carolina, Nevada, and New Hampshire. Now, some people had said to me early on, Marianne, you can't go to Iowa and talk about reparations for slavery. And I said, as would have been predicted by anyone who knows me well, just watch me. Because this part of interrupting the pattern of the status quo when it comes to politics is not trying to figure out what to say to make people like you or agree with you. I'm not running to be people pleaser in chief. I'm running to the best of my ability, articulate truth as I understand it. And I can tell you that every time I have mentioned, after talking much the way I've talked here tonight, every time I've then climaxed the conversation with saying, therefore, it seems to me we should pay reparations for slavery. Every time I've talked about this in Iowa, I've gotten applause. And every time I have talked about this in New Hampshire, I have gotten applause. And every time I have talked about this, even among white audiences in South Carolina, obviously among black audiences in South Carolina, but even among white audiences in South Carolina, I have gotten applause. Someone has harnessed fear for political purposes in this country. But you can't really fight dog whistles. You have to drown them out with angel voices. When Lincoln talked about the angels of our better nature, this was not a metaphor. Just as racism and bigotry, anti-Semitism, homophobia, Islamophobia are demons of the inner nature. Angels of the inner nature, of our better nature, are our love and our love for each other and our compassion and our love for our country and our love for our earth and our love for our unborn grandchildren. But those who hate, both in America and around the world, hate with conviction today. They hate with conviction, and conviction is a force multiplier. It's not that more people hate than love. I believe in this country, as well as around the world, far more people love than hate. But we need to start loving with the level of conviction and seriousness with which some people clearly display their hate. We can't just say, I love my own children. The love that will save the world is a love that is just as proactive and just as passionate for children on the other side of town and the other side of the world. Just as the love for our own home is not enough to save the world, there must be a recognition that the earth itself is our shared home. And so I believe in a politics that gives people the opportunity to do the noble thing. Why don't we just see what would happen if we gave people a chance to do the right thing? This country has done the right thing before. Generations have risen up before and did the right thing. They abolished slavery. They gave women the right to vote. They dismantled segregation and institutionalized white supremacy. If we stop the corruption of a politics that just tells people what you think they want to hear or tells them what you think they want so that they get what they want, and instead rise above that inherent narcissism and entitlement and selfishness, which is the malignancy of consciousness, and instead remind each other that we have more than rights when it comes to democracy. We have responsibilities, a responsibility to repair it where it has been broken, make it better, even better where it is already doing well, and bequeath it to our children even better than we found it. I believe that in the area of race, and in many areas, we need to atone for terrible mistakes we've made, get much more authentically real about ourselves, get out of denial, have a serious, authentic, fierce, and real conversation. And in my experience of religion and spirituality, as in Cassie's, that means a no bullshit zone. America needs to get real about race and do the right thing. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
The question is, the Northern, the press, they came together to end this. We are seeing also the military reconstruction coming into this. But now, why are we still having the legacy and the transition to Jim Crow? Why was it still successful? I know you might be asking yourself that question, right? Now listen, we have the short-term repeal. While the federal government actions during Reconstruction led to official repeal of the Black Codes, the underlying racial attitudes that motivated them persisted. Southern states grudgingly compiled with the Reconstruction policies, but once federal troops were withdrawn in 1877, as part of the Compromise of 1877, these states quickly moved to reassert white supremacy. The Southern people found many ways of removing, the military from entering into these talks, fighting for the rights of people. They fought so hard to remove these people, and this was the Compromise of 1877. Now, this embedded white supremacy, and now we're starting to see the rise of Jim Crow. Now Jim Crow started coming fully because the people who were preventing this, they compiled laws that removed them, and that we're talking about the Compromise of 1877. Now we're starting to see the rise of Jim Crow. In the late 19th century, now we are entering the 19th century. In the late 19th century, the principles of the Black Codes re-emerged in the form of Jim Crow laws. You can see how this thing is mutating. These laws institutionalized racial segregation and disenfranchisement of African Americans across the South. Through the poll taxes, literacy tests, and other discriminatory practices, Southern states effectively nullified the gains of African Americans had made during Reconstruction, stripping them of their voting rights and civil liberties. They were returning them to Black Codes, but now it's mutating. We're calling it Jim Crow. What today we are calling, we're calling the division, the divide which is happening between Black people and white people, known as the Jim Crow during those times, So now you might ask yourself, this thing is having a long-term impact to Black people, of course, as you know. Now the legacy of Black Code and the subsequent Jim Crow laws, this really had a profound and lasting impact on African Americans' life in the United States. The laws entrenched systemic racism, economic inequality, and social segregation, the effects of which are still evident in various forms of racial discrimination and inequality today. The struggle to overcome the legacy of these laws has been a central theme in the civil rights movements of the 20th century and the 21st century until to date. Now you might ask yourself, why do Black people need reparation? It is important because look at all those steps that this thing called Black Code took until it reached Jim Crow, until it is today where we call discrimination. And racial matters are still going on. Racial matters are still happening today in the United States, just as fresh as the way it was during the times of the Black Codes. You know what I'm saying? So this has its relevance in the contemporary day. we say that understanding these, black codes, it's really crucial to any black person. You get to see where you come from, you also get to see the tactics which were used to control and oppress our brothers and sisters during the Reconstruction era. This which was laid by the foundation of many systemic challenges that continue, which are still affecting the black communities until today. So we need to stand against these things and fight against these injustices, from abolition of the black codes to the civil rights movements, and then going efforts to address racial disparities. So it is important for us to still stand and fight for ourselves, fight for our rights, because freedom is not given, freedom is taken, just like they usually say. I hope that we've learned a lot, and I thank the professor for coming out and talking about this. And she explained vividly why the repentance is needed in politics, because the level of hypocrisy which was displayed during that time is really, really big. And it is time that we black people need to stand up in business. We black people also need to claim the reparation. I hope we all get to learn from the sister who stood up and she talked about this boldly. But I believe it's important for us to always talk about these issues because they are affecting us. This is your presenter, Eugene Toki Stories. And again, I remind you, if you're watching this video for the first time, I'll ask you to subscribe to the channel, join our membership, and really get to see what we can offer you. Until then, peace, love, and reparations. Salute.